In 1835, the town of Alton moved slowly. The river shifted like a sleeping animal, and most families lived within sight of the church steeple. Nothing escaped attention, but no one ever said too much either. At the edge of town sat the Porter house, white-painted, lace-curtained, perfectly ordinary, the kind of house that looked like it came with its own silence. Lorna Porter kept a garden that never failed, and Samuel Porter worked long shifts at the mill without complaint. Their windows were polished, their porch was swept, and the mailman said they never once missed a letter. But behind the polished normalcy, something was wrong, and it began with the books. The first to notice was midwife June Aberley, who had delivered over 70 babies in the county by the time she reached the Porter home. She found the room ready, scrubbed floors, folded linens, boiling water already set. What struck her was the ledger on the mantel, opened and pre-written. The baby's name had already been decided, the weight, the time of arrival, all blank lines, but the format was identical to what she'd seen on government forms. It was too clean, too prepared. When the child came, a girl, Lorna didn't weep or smile. She simply took the child, wiped her mouth with practiced ease, and handed her to Samuel, who stepped in just long enough to place the baby into a padded bassinet, then disappeared again into the hall. June never heard a single cry. She returned once for the 2-week wellness check, but no one answered the door. Over the next 8 years, 7 more children were registered to the Porters. Different midwives, different seasons, but always the same pattern. Every birth was logged with a full name, sometimes even middle names or familial meanings. Mercy Ann, Tobias Fielding, Claire Wither, names no one in town ever heard spoken aloud. Each was assigned a specific hour and weight, sometimes to the ounce, always signed in Samuel's hand. But none of the infants were seen again. There were no christenings, no neighbors bringing swaddling cloth or milk, no noise of toddlers in the garden. The house remained pristine, curtains closed, garden blooming, windows shut. When the county clerk, Mr. Halpern, compiled the census rolls for 1840, he hesitated. The records showed 8 births. But the town had no school enrollment from the Porters, no attendance at the children's church classes, no death certificates either. He visited the house under the pretense of collecting updated forms. Lorna answered in her apron, hair tied with blue ribbon, hands dry and flower pale. She offered tea, but not entry. When asked about the children, she smiled and said, "All well." Quiet children. "We raised them gently here," Halpern nodded and walked back to his cart with the form untouched. It wasn't until he reviewed the ledgers again that the cold settled in. Every child's name was written with the same pen stroke, the same pressure, the same perfect loop in every G. It was as if no hand but one had ever signed them into existence, and maybe none ever had. When the town slept, Lorna Porter moved. Never during the day, never when the sun might touch her hands or the shutters might swing open and reveal something too clearly. Always at night, always in that slow, gliding way that made it hard to tell whether her feet touched the ground at all. She drifted along the orchard path behind the house, between the pear trees she'd planted the year she arrived in Alton. Her arms curled around a cloth-wrapped bundle pressed tight to her chest. The bundle never made a sound, and neither did she. No one ever heard her cry. But the lullabies floated through the branches. Soft, wordless, wrong, too slow, too steady. The kind of song you hum to yourself when you're not trying to soothe a child but to remember one the world never saw. People said nothing to her face. They crossed streets politely, dipped their heads at Sunday gatherings, left baskets of bread at her gate when Samuel worked late shifts at the mill. But behind drawn curtains they whispered. They said she'd lost too many babies to speak of. They said she carried old grief like a fragile glass bowl. They said the orchard was where she talked to the dead, and maybe she did. But no one asked why there were no graves, no tiny headstones, no funeral hymns. They called it sadness, and sadness was easier to ignore. One night in early spring, the teacher from the schoolhouse, a woman named Ruth with sharp eyes and a sharper sense of time, couldn't sleep. She sat by her window just after 2 in the morning and watched Lorna pace the same crooked path around the orchard 5 times. On the 6th, Lorna stopped beneath a tree and knelt. Ruth leaned closer. The bundle shifted. It had weight. Lorna rocked it slowly, rhythmically whispering something Ruth couldn't hear. She stayed there for nearly 30 minutes, then rose and walked back inside without once turning her head. Ruth said nothing the next day but stopped leaving apples on the Porter porch. A drifter once asked about the house. Said he saw a woman in white walking a stillborn baby like it was alive. The sheriff laughed, called it a fever dream. But the drifter left town by nightfall and no one remembered his name. The orchard bloomed every year, even in dry seasons when other trees failed. Lorna pruned the branches with hands too clean for dirt, humming as she clipped. No one saw her weep. No one ever saw her smile either. Just that same quiet rhythm, bundle to chest, step to step, like each movement followed an unspoken rule. The kind of rule you don't write down because it's older than paper, older than law. And when the wind picked up at night, the lullabies carried farther. Past fences, past windows, into homes where mothers turned in their sleep and clutched their children closer, though they didn't know why. Joseph Ender was not a man, easily disturbed. He had worked in prisons and poorhouses, repaired roofs after fires, and once built gallows for the county courthouse. He took his pay in coin or bread and never asked too many questions. That spring, when Samuel Porter approached him outside the feed store and offered double his usual rate for a custom crib and wall paneling, Joseph agreed without blinking. He arrived at the Porter house on a Monday afternoon, toolbox in hand, expecting the usual quiet that hung around families with new infants. But the quiet here was different. It was thick, stale. Even the breeze outside seemed to stop at the Porter gate, unwilling to enter. Lorna met him at the door, her face calm, her dress starched and spotless. She said nothing more than what was needed. Second floor, end of the hall, materials already bought. He followed her silently up the narrow staircase, counting each step without knowing why. The room was small and square. There were no windows. The vent above the door had been sealed with cloth and nailed shut. A layer of chalky powder coated the corners of the room. Crushed sage, maybe, or lime. Joseph couldn't tell. The crib parts were stacked neatly, wrapped in linen, as if waiting for ritual rather than use. The floorboards beneath his boots were warm, too warm for a house this drafty. He asked where the child would sleep in the meantime. Lorna said the child didn't fuss. She said it was a quiet baby, like the dark. Joseph didn't respond. He had no children of his own, never wanted any. Still, something in her tone pulled at him in a place he thought had long since dried out. He set to work, sawing and joining the crib rails with a focus that came from habit more than comfort. As he worked, he noticed the walls had been recently repainted, but not well. Layers upon layers of white, as if trying to smother something beneath. The wood beneath the paint felt strange, soft in places. He tapped once and heard a hollow thud that didn't match the room's shape. A compartment, a cavity, something sealed behind plaster and intention. By the 3rd hour, he was sweating through his shirt, though no heat source was in sight. The air was still sour, heavy with something that clung to his lungs like wet wool. He opened the door for relief, but Lorna was there, holding a bowl of broth. She didn't hand it to him. She simply set it on the floor and stared at the crib's half-finished frame. Then she turned and walked away. He left the bowl untouched. That night he returned with a lantern. He told himself it was to finish the job early. In truth, he couldn't sleep. Something had followed him home. A rhythm in his ears, a pulse in his jaw. He entered the room and placed the lantern on the floor. Then, driven by something colder than curiosity, he pulled a chisel from his belt and began scraping the wall where he'd heard the hollow sound. The plaster crumbled easier than it should have. Behind it, a wood panel. Behind the wood, cloth. Behind the cloth, a mask. Not a face, but a stitched impression of one. Mouth sewn closed, eyes painted open. Beneath it, bones. Small ones, arranged in the shape of a spine, but far too short for any adult. A name was stitched into the cloth. Tobias Fielding Porter. Joseph did not scream. He backed away slowly, replaced the panel without a word, and left the house without his tools. 2 days later, his neighbor found him in his shed, trembling and silent, teeth shattered from clenching too hard. When asked what happened, he only muttered, "No air. No air in the walls." He packed his bags and left town that night. No forwarding address, no goodbye. Just the echo of something buried in plaster and silence, still pulsing behind the Porter nursery, waiting for its next name. The Porter cellar was not used for food. No roots hung from the ceiling. No pickled jars lined the walls. It had no chill to it, no scent of earth. Instead, it carried the faint metallic sweetness of something over-preserved, something that had no reason to linger. In 1841, a young man named Elias Trum was sent by his mentor, Dr. Halvers, to deliver a bundle of tinctures to Mrs. Porter. It was an errand Elias took without question. The Porters paid in silver. They asked no questions, but when he arrived and found no one answering the bell, he let himself around the back to leave the parcel by the storm doors. What stopped him was the faint sound beneath his boots. Not voices, not footsteps, but a steady drip, as if something thick and deliberate fell drop by drop from one age to another. The storm doors were unlocked. He descended the steps, drawn not by curiosity, but a kind of magnetic cold that pressed into his skin before he touched the iron latch. The cellar walls were smooth stone, older than the rest of the house, with lines carved into them too precise to be accidental. There was no lamp, but some kind of faint glow leaked from a shelf near the far corner. It was there, just behind a crooked beam, that Elias noticed a brick out of place. It stuck slightly from the wall like a tongue half-bitten. He pressed it. It gave way. Behind it, a hollow slot, and inside a folded scrap of vellum etched with chemical notations and ratios. It wasn't handwriting he recognized. It was too straight, too patient, as if the words had been drawn rather than written. The formula was strange. 1 part saltpeter, 3 parts powdered glass, a trace of fennel oil, and something called tremble root, which Elias had only ever read about in banned European journals. The mixture was described not as medicine, but as slurry for internal silence. Instructions followed in chilling detail. Immersion must begin within 6 minutes of birth. Temperature must be lukewarm, agitation not required. Final state, still, pliable, odorless. Elias stared at the page longer than he meant to. His mouth had gone dry. When he looked up, his eyes adjusted to the corner shelf, and there, hung neatly on a line of fine copper wire, were 12 small linen tags. Each was embroidered with a name and a date, all spaced precisely 4 to 6 months apart. The dates aligned with the town's quiet whispers of Porter births. Each tag was slightly stiff, and he realized they'd been dipped in something. Preserved, maybe stained. He touched one. It cracked faintly under his finger. They were not just keepsakes. They were ritual entries, trophies. At the base of the shelf sat an iron basin, shallow and blackened, crusted with something white at its edges. He leaned in and caught the sharpness of glass dust. Beneath that, fennel, yes, sweet and medicinal. But fouled by another scent, a human note. Not rot, not blood. Something preserved too long in denial. His knees shook as he stood. He backed away and turned to leave, but caught the edge of a crate and sent it tumbling. It broke open. Inside were linen wraps, each bearing a faint indentation. Not large, not full forms, but enough to know that something once human had been nestled there. Empty now. Light as husks. Elias fled without the tinctures, without his hat, without memory of how he got back to the clinic. When Dr. Halvers questioned him, he only handed over the vellum and wept into his sleeves. Halvers burned the page, told Elias never to speak of it, and sent a polite note to the porters saying the boy had fallen ill. But years later, Halvers would confide to a colleague that the formula had been real, not just functional, but advanced. Too advanced. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to preserve a body in a state just shy of living. And the tags, he said, were not memorials. They were time stamps, labels for specimens, records of the moment a child was transformed into something that could be stored, catalogued, and never mourned. James Hurley had prepared the dead for over 30 years, but there was something about the porter requests that made his skin sit too tight on his bones. The notes always came folded in thirds, written in perfect script, never stained or smudged. They were addressed to him directly, though he'd never once spoken face-to-face with Lorna or Samuel Porter. Each note listed what was needed: a length of white linen, half-yard for wrapping, a basin of rosemary-washed cotton, sometimes a pine box no larger than a bread loaf to be left at the back gate before sundown. They always paid in advance, always in silver coins polished, always in the exact amount. He should have reported it after the third request. He didn't. Most in town didn't. The porters, people said, were quiet and clean, which made them easy to ignore. Still, what haunted James wasn't the notes or the silence or the precise nature of the deliveries. It was the absence of sound. He had stood no more than 10 feet from that house a dozen times, sometimes waiting to retrieve the boxes, sometimes to drop off bleach or fresh linen, and never once did he hear a single baby's cry, not from a window, not from the cellar doors, not even a fuss or a coo or the soft patter of crawling feet. And yet, the requests kept coming. 13 times over the years, all logged in the small black book he kept beside his shaving mirror. He never said the word infant. He never had to. The weight of those boxes said enough. On one particular evening, the year the orchard lost its leaves too early, James arrived a few minutes past the usual hour. He had meant to leave the linen and go, but something caught his attention. A flicker behind the nursery curtain, a shape moving too slow to be shadow. He knocked once. The door creaked open. Not fully. Just enough for the smell to find him. It wasn't rot. It wasn't even unpleasant. It was sweet, thick, something between honey and old wax. He stepped back, dizzy, and dropped the parcel without looking inside. But what stayed with him wasn't the smell. It was the sound of the cradle as it rocked. Not back and forth, not like a mother would do, but in short, repeated taps, precise, mechanical, as though someone had learned the motion without ever knowing the reason. He told the sheriff in passing a few days later, mentioned the smell, the silence, the steady rhythm that didn't feel alive. The sheriff laughed and said grief was a quiet teacher. Some mothers rocked their pain instead of their children. That was the end of it, at least on paper. A few years later, a new undertaker's apprentice named Micah took over some of the delivery rounds. When Micah returned from his first trip to the porterhouse, he vomited behind the shed and asked James if babies could be born without lungs. James didn't answer. Micah never went back. James did one final delivery the winter before he retired. It had snowed heavily that week, and the porch was perfectly cleared, as if someone had swept each flake before it touched wood. He knocked out of habit, knowing no one would answer. But this time, the door was already ajar. Inside, he saw the cradle, not in shadow, not behind a curtain, but full in the open, lit by the gray light of a snow sky. It was empty, but too clean, cleaner than any wood should be. The grain looked scrubbed, bleached until no trace of breath could remain. No milk bottle, no toy, no blanket folded or tossed, just stillness thick as plaster. On the wall above the cradle hung a strip of fabric framed in glass. It wasn't decorative, it was white linen stitched with dates, each one spaced 5 months apart, each one aligned with the names in his black book. James didn't knock again after that. He stopped logging the requests, stopped asking questions. He burned the book before spring, and when asked years later why he retired so suddenly, he said something had changed in him. He said, "You can tell when death visits a house, and you can tell when it never leaves. But you can't explain why the babies never cried. You can only remember the yup, silence, the sweet smell, and the way grief doesn't sound like wailing at all. It sounds like nothing, and sometimes nothing is worse." Agnes Brill was young, cautious, and trained by hard winters. She had delivered stillborns in barns, set broken hips in snowstorms, and learned to keep her voice low when men argued near the birthing beds. She was new to Alton, and when she was called to the porterhouse for her first delivery there, she accepted without pause. It was the 7th birth the town had whispered about, the 7th name recorded, the 7th child no one would ever see. The other midwives had grown older, quieter, less willing to knock on the porter door. Agnes had no such weight in her chest yet. She left the clinic at dusk, carrying a bag lined in clean linen and lavender oil. She never came back. By morning, no one panicked. Midwives often stayed through the night. It was part of the job. But when she didn't return the next day and her boots were found left neatly by the clinic steps as if she'd meant to slip back into them soon, the whispers grew. Her replacement, a timid woman named Eliza Dorn, was sent 3 days later to retrieve her tools and check on the porter mother under the guise of professional follow-up. Eliza didn't make it to the front door. She found the garden gate unlatched, the grass crushed in uneven paths. At the edge of the orchard, she saw something pale near the root of a pear tree. It was Agnes's apron, torn down the middle, the hem stiff with something dark that smelled faintly like old copper and sugar. In the apron pocket was a folded note, creased carefully, sealed with a pin. One word had been written on it in shaking ink: lungs. Eliza dropped the cloth and fled back to town without speaking. The sheriff was called. He questioned Lorna first, who answered the door with her hair pinned and her sleeves rolled as if caught in the middle of nothing at all. She said Agnes left after the birth and never returned. She said perhaps she wandered back to the main road and was taken by drifters or madness. She said nothing more. Her hands were clean. The sheriff looked at the garden, the orchard, the apron, and said maybe it was coyotes. That winter had made the animals bold. But a retired nurse named Mabel Greaves came forward weeks later. She'd been called to the porterhouse once years before when the 2nd child was said to have been stillborn. She remembered the room, not the child. She never saw one. But she remembered the heavy silence and how Lorna had asked her to remain outside the nursery while she prepared the lungs. Mabel didn't understand it at the time, thought it was grief or perhaps some old custom from a foreign book. But the words never left her. Prepare the lungs, as if they were not for breathing but for something else. A quiet search was conducted in the spring. Discreet men from the county came with papers and gloves. They found no grave, no blood, no remains. but they found a small metal hook buried in the orchard soil, shaped like a shepherd's crook dulled with rust. Not farm equipment, not something made for pulling weeds. It was too precise, designed perhaps to guide something soft through a narrow space. It matched nothing in their inventory of medical tools. The sheriff closed the case. Years later, a surgeon from Chicago passed through Alton and stopped by the local clinic, where old Eliza Dorn still worked. She told him about Agnes, about the apron, about the word. The surgeon listened and went pale. He said the lungs of a newborn, if removed quickly and preserved in salt or glycerin, could remain pliable for days. He said some believed they held the essence of breath, that certain fringe practitioners once claimed those lungs could be used in attempts to mimic life in dolls or other forms. He said it like a man recounting a myth. But Eliza remembered the tone. It wasn't myth, it was warning. Agnes Brill was never found. Her name was etched into the back wall of the church beside other lost mothers and forgotten daughters. No body, no funeral, just a memory pressed into silence. The orchard bloomed anyway. The house remained quiet. And behind its clean curtains, Lorna Porter continued to walk the same path through the trees each night, her arms still full, her steps still steady, as if nothing had ever gone missing at all. Children in Alton knew not to play near the Porter house. It wasn't spoken as a rule, but passed through glances and quick tugs at sleeves when a game of hide-and-seek wandered too far. Still one boy, Levi Granger, age 7, crawled under the Porter's back porch chasing a silver marble that had rolled from his pocket during a game. He didn't mean to find anything, but when he reached into the dirt, his fingers closed around a button. Not plastic, not wood, but something smooth and slightly warm, shaped by hand. The edge was carved with tiny notches. The middle was pierced clean through. He pulled 2 more from the soil nearby, each one different but all made from the same strange material. That night he showed his mother. She screamed, not because of what they were, but because she had seen buttons like that before. Years ago, on a shawl worn by Lorna Porter at a church auction. The shawl had gone missing. Lorna claimed it was lost to mildew, but the buttons were here now, under her porch, scraped and dirt-worn, too heavy to forget. The sheriff arrived 2 days later, this time with a warrant, though he didn't say what it was for. He entered through the kitchen, was offered tea by Samuel, and declined. When he asked about the sewing room, Lorna stood and led him without protest. She even unlocked the door for him, handed him the key as if it meant nothing. Inside, the air was heavy with dried herbs and starch. Spools of wire sat in neat rows. Bone-handled scissors gleamed on a velvet tray. At first glance, it looked like any meticulous woman's craft space. Until he noticed the quilts. They were stacked carefully, layered between tissue and wrapped in string. Each one bore a pattern, not flowers or stars, but spirals, concentric and exact, drawn in lines of what looked like thread until he touched one. It wasn't thread. It was wire no thicker than a hair, looped through fabric so finely it left no tears. And stitched into the edges of each spiral were teeth. Tiny, pale, sharp-rooted teeth. Baby teeth. Hundreds of them. Some yellowed, some white, some still tinged pink at the base. Each tooth had been stitched with a thin loop of copper and laid flat like a coin offering. The sheriff backed away, nearly knocking over a frame propped against the wall. Inside it was a panel of buttons, not decorative, not uniform, but carved. Some were shaped like half-moons, some in tiny ridges like ribs, others more irregular. One still bore the faint impression of marrow on the underside. In the corner of the room sat a basket filled with scraps of fabric, each marked in one corner with a name embroidered in clean cursive. No last names, just first names. Mercy, Tobias, Eliah, Claire, a dozen in total, each one folded over a single black thread that ran down the center like a spine. The sheriff didn't ask questions, he didn't speak. He simply turned and walked out of the room and asked Lorna what the quilts were for. She said they were memory work. She said women kept what the world threw away and she kept hers in patterns. When he asked where the teeth came from, she smiled slightly and said children lose them all the time. Most mothers throw them away. She didn't. The sheriff filed no report. He told no one what he saw. But he never walked past the Porter home again, not even on patrol. That summer, Levi Granger's mother quietly moved her family out of Alton. She told people her husband had taken work in Springfield, but she packed the house in 2 days and left a note on the church board that read simply, "Under the porch, not safe." The quilts were never mentioned again. But people noticed Lorna no longer came to town events with her hands empty. She always carried a wrapped bundle, no larger than a tea tray, pressed to her chest like a prayer. And sometimes, late in the evening, the wind would carry a dry, rustling sound across the orchard. The soft clink of wire, the dull chime of teeth tapping in rhythm. The sound of something unfinished being stitched in the dark. Samuel Porter was a quiet man by every account. He rose early, took his bread without butter, walked to the mill and returned home before dark. He kept his nails short, his shirts buttoned, and his conversations to no more than a few polite nods. To the town, he was a man of quiet labor and loyalty, the kind who stayed out of gossip and paid his debts. He brought his lunch in a cloth sack and always sat at the edge of the brake line, close enough to listen but never close enough to be asked questions. When the rumors about his wife swelled, whispers of too many births, too few children, too many deliveries followed by funerals with no graves, Samuel said nothing. When questioned directly by the sheriff, he shrugged and said he worked too many hours to know much about what happened at home, and most accepted that. A man at the mill 6 days a week couldn't possibly know what went on behind the nursery door. But there was a cabinet in the attic of the Porter house. It had no lock, but Lorna never opened it. It belonged to Samuel alone. Inside were journals, not diaries, not records of dreams or prayer, but methodical notes written in black ink, each one dated, each one numbered. The handwriting was small, almost surgical, with margins filled in tight columns. The first few books were borrowed medical texts: human physiology, prenatal development, anatomy of the larynx and lungs. But they didn't stop at reading. Samuel had annotated them. He'd redrawn diagrams to scale. He'd made adjustments in the margins. He had theories about how sound was formed, how it could be stopped, not through muting or binding, but through anatomical adjustments, precise and bloodless. A method to remove the function of cry without damaging the organs entirely. A silence that preserved life without drawing attention. He had tables comparing the length of tracheas in infants from different gestation periods. He had notes on how to suppress blood flow during delivery to reduce mess, to keep linens clean, to create the appearance of untouched birth. He cross-referenced herbal compounds with their effects on tissue elasticity and muscle stillness. There were entire pages on nerve interruption, gentle, subtle techniques that didn't require cutting, just pressure applied to the right spot at the right time. Some pages included the word success. Others had names, first names only, followed by numbers. One entry read, Tobias, 38 minutes, full stillness achieved. Breath stopped without cyanosis. Another said, Claire, incomplete. Diaphragm spasm returned at 26 minutes. Adjust technique for next attempt. To anyone else, the journals might have looked like mad scribbling. But to the one coroner brought in years later, a former military surgeon, they were something worse. They were experiments in quieting life without killing it. Not for mercy, not for science, for control, for silence so complete it left no evidence behind. The surgeon said only one other place he'd seen work like this was during battlefield experiments meant to delay death long enough for interrogation. But these notes didn't aim to prolong. They aimed to still, and to still permanently. Samuel never raised his voice, never left town, never missed a shift. But he kept his hands clean in a way that felt practiced. He washed under his nails too long, folded his sleeves too perfectly. A neighbor once remarked that he'd never seen a man who worked with iron return home without a single stain on his collar. When the county eventually investigated the porter's home after Lorna's detainment, they found the journals in a wooden box labeled Reference. It was not hidden. It was shelved neatly between church hymnals and a child's Bible. To the public, Samuel Porter claimed he knew nothing, that Lorna handled the births, that he stayed out of the nursery, that he mourned as best he could. But the pages told another story, one written in measurements, methods, and quiet margins, one that proved he didn't need to hear the infants cry to know they had stopped, because he was the one who figured out how to make sure they never would. The letter came without a signature, folded twice and slid under the courthouse door sometime between dusk and dawn. It contained no accusation, no plea, just an address, a list of dates, and a single line written in firm, narrow script. Not one child, not ever. Ask why. The town board dismissed it as gossip at first, the kind that circled too long in quiet places and turned into rot. But the judge insisted. A wellness inspection was scheduled under Health Ordinance Code. No suspicion was formally recorded. Just an opportunity to check on the well-being of a household that had for too long remained too quiet. 3 men arrived that Monday morning. 1 health officer, 1 clerk, 1 appointed witness from the town church. They knocked twice before Lorna Porter opened the door. Her dress was blue. Her hands were clean. She said the house was in order but stepped aside without protest. The moment they entered, all 3 noticed the same thing. It was not the smell, there was none. It was not the silence. They expected that. It was the absence of anything that ever suggested children had lived there. The wooden floorboards were polished smooth with no scratches or scuff marks. The baseboards showed no crayon, no muddy shoe prints, no chipped corners from a toppled toy. There were no smudges on the windows, no fingerprints on the banister, no high chair or feeding cloth, no milk bottles stacked by the stove. Only the faint scent of lemon oil and something sweeter, chemical, like a memory forced into a bottle. They moved through the rooms one by one, searching for signs of presence, signs of noise. In the pantry, they found canning jars labeled by month and year, each shelf organized with military precision. In the linen closet, folded quilts, but not the bone quilts, not these, were stacked by size and season. In the nursery, the cradle sat motionless, dustless, and empty. The sheets were too smooth. The rocking chair had no wear along its arms, no dolls, no books, not even the light indentation of a child's head left behind on a pillow. The inspector opened the wardrobe and found only folded gowns. Nothing miniature, nothing handmade, no shoes small enough to belong to anyone under the age of 10. And yet, the ledger in town claimed at least 8 births. The home gave no sign that a single one had ever drawn breath. Then one of the men tried the small cabinet built into the wall behind the cradle. The handle turned but did not give. It was locked but not from the outside. The latch was fastened from within. There was no visible keyhole, no sound came from it, but something was wrong with the air around it. A kind of thickness, as though the wood had its own weight separate from the room. The clerk pressed his ear to the panel. He said he thought he heard a soft pulse. Not mechanical, not human. Just rhythm. A steady, distant beat, like something preserved too long but still remembering it once had motion. They left the house with no cause to detain, No legal reason to pursue, only questions they were too afraid to write down. When asked back at the courthouse if the home was safe, the health officer said yes. Immaculate, spotless, the cleanest house in Illinois. But his eyes said something else, and that night he burned his inspection notes in the fireplace before his wife could ask why he smelled of lemons and salt and iron. The Porters were never visited again. No second inspection was filed. But that cabinet, the one no one opened, remained part of town folklore for decades. Children dared each other to knock on the Porter gate and whisper to the wood, hoping to hear what pulsed behind it. No one ever did, but the orchard trees nearby always bloomed a week early and always in silence. It took nearly 2 decades before anyone dared enter the Porter house by force. By then, too many stories had piled up like rotting fruit at the edge of a closed market. A quiet child who disappeared after a visit. A midwife who never came home. Linen deliveries requested too often. A sheriff who retired early and refused to give a reason. And that final anonymous letter, dropped on the judge's desk and sealed with nothing but twine, was the last push the town needed. When the raid was ordered, they expected to find something. Records, jars, journals, anything that could put form to the dread they had lived beside for years. What they did not expect was the cellar. Not what it held, not what it sounded like, not what it knew. The stairs creaked as they descended. 7 men, 2 with lanterns, 1 with the warrant folded inside his vest, and all with something uneasy in their steps. The door had been barricaded from within, but not with nails. It was sealed with a layer of salt pressed under the frame, mixed with a pale resin that cracked like wax when disturbed. When the door swung open, a rush of heat struck them, dry, faintly sweet, like air exhaled from lungs that had been holding too long. The blueprints of the house kept in the county archives listed the cellar as a single stone-lined room meant for winter storage. But what they found was deeper, far deeper. A second staircase, nearly vertical, led to an area no one had mapped. The stone gave way to copper-laced brick. The air buzzed faintly, not like electricity, like breath. The floor down there was not solid. It was made of wide slats of oiled wood, too polished, too smooth, separated by tiny seams, each precisely measured. When one of the men stepped forward, the panel beneath him shifted. Beneath the wood was not dirt. It was a compartment, shallow, lined in wax, copper, and stitched canvas. 11 such compartments stretched in perfect rows beneath the floor. 11 identical cradles built not to rock, but to preserve. Not to warm, but to hum. 10 were sealed, their lids bolted down and marked with nothing but a carved number. One compartment was open, the 12th. It was empty, but still warm. Not recently used and constantly used, as if waiting. As if always meant to remain vacant until something perfect was found. They pried open the first sealed box. Inside lay no skeleton, no corpse, just a shape, swaddled and still, wrapped in linen so finely wound it looked molded to the body beneath. There were no signs of decomposition, no odor. The linen pulsed faintly, as if something inside had been trained not to die, only to sleep. A faint residue covered the inside of the lid. Powdered glass, fennel traces, and saltpeter, just as the burned formula had once warned. Each compartment held a child-shaped form in the same pose, arms folded inward, mouths sealed not with thread but with a wax stamp that covered the lips entirely. The seal bore the same spiral found in Lorna's quilts. The walls of the cellar were layered with metal sheets behind the brick, a crude insulation system. A slow warmth radiated from somewhere unseen, not enough to burn, just enough to stop time. One of the men dropped his lantern. It didn't shatter, but the flame hissed and went out, as if the room itself rejected noise, heat, light, anything that might awaken or disturb the hush it had been built to protect. They tried to speak. Their voices faltered. The cellar didn't echo. It absorbed. No one stayed long. They carried out what they could, but records were never filed completely. The men aged quickly after that day. Hair went gray in months. Hands shook. One lost the ability to sleep unless a humming sound was nearby. The open 12th chamber haunted them all. What was it meant for? Who had it been saved for? And why was it still warm, as if it had always been waiting not for something to be buried, but for something to return? The infant was found inside the 4th compartment they opened, smaller than the others, swaddled so tightly in oil-treated cloth that its shape barely moved under breath or pressure. The men had opened it carefully, expecting another linen-wrapped absence, another bundle of halted time. But when the cloth unfurled, they saw eyes. Not blinking, not shut, just open, glassy, fixed, and far too clear. The child did not cry, did not flinch, did not move in any way that could be called living. But there was something behind the eyes that hadn't entirely gone. The body was warm, but not with fever. The chest didn't rise, yet it hadn't stiffened. The lungs were collapsed inwards, the coroner would later say, but not from suffocation. They had been drained, trained to stay still, as if the act of breathing had been interrupted mid-inhale and never resumed. The baby was neither cold nor bloated. It hadn't spoiled. It hadn't faded. It had simply stopped at the exact line between life and death and had stayed there as if held by a thread too fine to see. There was a note pinned to the linen over its chest, one word written in perfect slanted script. Perfectly still. No name. No date. Just a judgment. Or perhaps a declaration of success. The coroner, brought from Springfield days later, studied the body with a reverence that made the others sick. He called it methodical nerve suspension, a term borrowed from experiments long banned across medical institutions. He traced the signs. The pale blue ring beneath the fingernails, the undamaged spine, the micropuncture at the base of the skull where something had clearly been inserted or extracted. He said the infant's nervous system had been quieted deliberately, not stunned or killed, but silenced. The way a wire can carry current without letting it spark. He said this wasn't an accident, or even a preservation attempt. It was a result, something achieved, something practiced, something perfected. They checked the other compartments again, looking for signs they had missed, but none of the others held this same strange in-betweenness. The rest were cold, still, gone. But this one, the one with the whisper behind the eyes, had been different from the beginning. The wax seal on its mouth had a second layer beneath it, not visible until peeled back. A thin mesh, almost like lace, woven across the lips. It was surgical, handmade. The stitches had fused to the skin but left no blood. The child's tongue was coated in something powdery and bitter-smelling, and the throat had been filled with a substance the coroner couldn't name. It wasn't to embalm. It was to hold in place. The vocal cords were intact, but they had never been allowed to stretch, as though the body had been raised without ever being born. No one touched the infant after that. No one wanted to. It was placed back into its compartment with the note replaced exactly where it had been found. The coroner suggested it be left undisturbed until higher authorities arrived. But the report never reached them. The sheriff, who had once ignored the quiet, now chose to bury it, literally. He ordered the compartment resealed, the crate carried to the far orchard and lowered into a dry trench under the oldest tree. It was never marked, no name, no stone, just soil packed tightly over the wood and a silence even heavier than before. Some said they still saw the child in dreams, not moving, not crying, just watching from behind closed lids, not quite alive, not quite lost. as if it had been made not to be loved or raised or mourned, but simply to exist as proof that silence could be forced into the body and made to stay. Not forever, just long enough to be called success. The trial of Lorna and Samuel Porter began with the weight of 15 years of silence and ended with even more. By the time the court convened, the town of Alton was divided down to its floorboards, half clinging to the polite fiction that the Porters were merely touched by grief and half too afraid to say what they had long suspected. The charges listed were vague, the evidence circumstantial, and the victims, if they could even be called that, had no voices to speak for themselves. No birth records had been falsified, no graves had been desecrated, no bodies, not in the way the law demanded, had been found bearing marks of death. What they had was a cellar no one could explain, a bundle marked perfectly still, and a pair of names whispered in every dark corner of the county. Lorna entered the courtroom in her Sunday dress, white gloves buttoned at the wrist, hair smooth as glass. She walked like someone unbothered by consequence, as if the entire process bored her more than it frightened her. When asked her name, she gave it without emotion. When asked if she understood the charges, she looked past the clerk and said nothing. She sat with her hands folded for 6 days. She didn't blink too often, she didn't shake. When presented with the journals found in Samuel's attic, she tilted her head slightly like a seamstress checking a hem. When shown the teeth from the quilts, the linen tags, the sealed compartments, she offered no protest, no denial, no confession, only stillness, as though stillness itself had been her answer all along. Samuel did not fare the same. On the 3rd day, when asked about the annotations in his books, the measurements, the methods, the diagrams, he stood to speak and then dropped to the floor before a word left his mouth. Some said it was the weight of guilt. Others whispered about poison. The truth was simpler. He hadn't eaten in 3 days, and he hadn't slept in more than 6. The mind can only hold so much horror before it begins to slip. He was carried from the courtroom and never returned to it. He was declared medically unfit to stand trial and confined to his home under watch, where he was later seen wandering the orchard in his nightclothes, fingers twitching like he was still turning imaginary pages. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. There were no live witnesses, no children to testify, no death certificates. And the one infant found, if it could still be called that, was not legally dead. The judge asked for a verdict with his eyes already lowered. The foreman stood and read it aloud. Insufficient evidence. There were gasps. A woman in the gallery wept quietly into her gloves, but there was no outcry, no appeals. The verdict stood. The court recessed. The porterhouse was auctioned the following spring. The county cleaned it, stripped it, boarded up the cellar without removing what lay beneath. The winning bid came from a doctor in St. Louis who claimed he wanted to turn the house into a place of healing and quiet reflection. No one followed up. No one went to see it. The house remained empty. The pear trees bloomed again, even heavier that year, dropping fruit that rotted before it hit the ground. Some said they could still hear lullabies at night drifting over the orchard. Not sung, not hummed, just carried, like breath that never fully left the lungs. The case files were sealed. The jurors moved on. The town returned to silence, and Lorna Porter, though found neither guilty nor innocent, remained exactly what she had always been. Something quiet, something watched, and something the law could not name. The Porter house stood longer than it should have. Long after the verdict, long after Lorna's name faded from the lips of those still willing to speak it, the building remained. It sagged in places, lost shingles, grew ivy where windows used to be. But the wood never rotted completely. The orchard, though untended, continued to bloom in strange patterns. Fruit arriving weeks early, some trees blossoming twice in a single season. The town grew around the house, not into it. Roads curved to avoid its lot. New homes stood at a distance never built directly across. Children crossed the street to walk past it, even in daylight. It became a place defined not by memory but by avoidance. And so it sat, still intact, wrong, for nearly 50 years. It was finally torn down in 1884, not by order but by accident. A fire started in the neighboring lot, a controlled burn meant to clear overgrowth, but wind caught the flame and the northeast corner of the porterhouse was scorched. That was all the county needed, a structural excuse, a line item. The demolition crew came 2 weeks later. No cameras, no crowd. Just 4 men with shovels, crowbars, and instructions to work fast. The cellar had already been filled in with concrete years before, a final act of denial. They didn't expect to find anything. The house, by all public record, had been emptied and sealed. But under the nursery floor, sitakorthed beneath 3 layers of hardwood, a wool rug, and a lattice of wire mesh, they found the slips. Folded into neat squares, each wrapped in silk that had faded but not crumbled, each sealed with wax soft as if it had been pressed only yesterday. There were no bodies, no bones, no remains, just names, dates, weights, times of birth, all handwritten, all intact. Over 200 of them. They had been stored in layers, some placed side by side, others stacked with delicate cotton between them, as if each had been preserved like a prayer. The handwriting never changed. Every loop and stroke remained identical across decades. The ink never smudged. The paper had not yellowed. It was as if time had stopped beneath those boards and simply waited to be noticed. Each slip bore a first name, sometimes a middle, never a last. A few repeated, but most were unique. Mercy, Tobias, Claire, Elias, Jonah, Ruth, Eliah, Mira, Thomason. Some were marked with an asterisk. Others had small notes beside them in fine pencil. Held breath 3 minutes, took to wire, failed to hold. No sound at birth. None had confirmation of life. None had any sign of death, just that fragile, chilling record of existence, names given, lives never lived, and nowhere among those hundreds of slips did the names of Lorna or Samuel Porter appear, as if even in their madness they separated themselves from the weight of the lives they named and never raised. The town held a hearing, not public, quiet, quick. The slips were archived but not displayed. A memorial was commissioned the following year, a stone wall built beside the church cemetery, but not inside its bounds. It bore no full names, no statues, just a list of initials carved into granite, 212 of them spaced in rows, unread aloud by anyone who passed. A few locals brought flowers in the first months. A school teacher left a basket of baby shoes. But eventually the wall was forgotten. Vines crept over it. The etchings dulled. A small sign was added decades later to explain its presence, but no one read it. The names had no families. The births had no deaths. The grief had no voices. And so the memorial remained quiet, just like the house before it. Years passed. The orchard was cleared. The land sold. A post office now stands where the porterhouse once sat, though its staff report odd failures in the nursery wing, where the printer sees and the heating vents hum without power. Local children say that if you kneel near the foundation at dusk and press your ear to the ground, you can still hear soft scratching. Not voices, not cries, just the rustling sound of paper as if names are still being folded underfoot. No new children have ever been born on that land. None carried to term in the nearby homes. Some say the soil remembers. Others say the house was never meant to raise anything. It was meant to name, to label, to mark, and then to stop. A place that cataloged silence, that raised nothing but stillness, that perfected the art of pretending something existed simply because it was written down. And in the end, that's what remained. Not the bodies, not the laws, not even the guilt. Just initials carved into stone no one visits, representing children who were named carefully, meticulously, lovingly perhaps, but never truly born.